Mario Kart 64 was, and for many still is, the definitive party game experience. Sure, we've got Double Dash, Mario Kart 8, and now Mario Kart World, but there's something so great about this classic racer that's kept it driving around people's minds for decades. But there is so much more to this game than meets the eye. Thanks to in-depth developer interviews telling us about the dangers of hard drive failures, early gameplay footage shows us a completely scrapped racer, and not to mention the Giga Leak. Did you know that sharks were originally intended to be added to the game to attack racers? Well, you're going to learn all about that and so much more on Beta64, as we learn about the development history and scrap findings in Mario Kart 64. But first, a word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Extra, maker of the world's #1 rated wallet. I've personally used this Extra wallet for over 4 years, and I thought I couldn't do any better until I met the Extra Wallet Pro. Complete with a new metal card ejector and an increased 7-card capacity. It's super slim with RFID protection, and by adding the Extra Finder card, you can easily track it in the Find My app, which means you can get alerted if you ever leave it behind. Anything from Extra would make a fantastic gift for the father figure in your life, and you can get a huge deal during the Extra's Father's Day sale. Stack my promo code Beta64 on top of the sale to get up to 50% off site-wide right now. The sale only lasts until June 26th, so click the link in the description and check it out today. And now, let's talk about the development of Mario Kart 64. While we don't know exactly when Mario Kart 64 began development, my best guess would be sometime in 1994 or early 1995. That would be about 2 or 3 years after Super Mario Kart was released on the SNES. Super Mario Kart was, of course, the start of the Mario Kart series, and it was highly successful. As a matter of fact, it's the 4th best-selling game ever made for the SNES. So, for the first sequel of the Mario Kart series, the development team behind Mario Kart 64 wanted to continue this winning formula created by its predecessor. But with Mario Kart 64, there was a big difference. Even though Miyamoto was heavily involved in the development of Super Mario Kart, when the time came to make the sequel, he was far too busy working on Super Mario 64 to help out. This was particularly tough for Mario Kart 64's development team, since they wanted to launch their game alongside the Nintendo 64. But without Miyamoto, they would need to gather support from other departments to help fill the void. Though, to be honest, even if Miyamoto was there from the beginning, they still would have needed quite a bit of help. This being a Nintendo 64 game, the team wanted to make it in 3D, obviously. The problem was that they weren't very experienced with that technology. Hideki Kono was the director of both Super Mario Kart and Mario Kart 64, and he ended up having a particularly hard time working in 3D. I mean, figuring out how to do collision detection in a whole new dimension was one of the most difficult things that the team had to program, though they did make it a bit harder on themselves than they had to. See, other 3D racing games at the time would try to simplify things by limiting where you could race, blocking you in with barricades or maybe fences. But the Mario Kart 64 team decided that they wanted most of the tracks to be a completely open experience, where the player could practically drive wherever they wanted to. That kind of freedom made things like collision detection tough, since it was harder to predict where things were going to come at you from. Of course, in the end, they managed to figure that collision detection out, but that was far from the only issue that plagued the development of Mario Kart 64. Now, it might be a bit strange hearing that the team developing Mario Kart 64 had so many issues making the game. I mean, sure, the jump to 3D was going to cause some kind of headache, but what did they actually change in this sequel that caused so many issues? Well, Super Mario Kart was specifically designed as a 2-player racing game. That was its major selling point. So with Mario Kart 64, they wanted to take advantage of the 4 controller ports on the console, and that meant 4-player racing. Didn't seem like it'd be too difficult to pull off, but with double the racers came double the issues. The first concern was about the limited resolution of the Nintendo 64. After all, with 4 players, each of them only got a small corner of the screen. But it wasn't too bad of an issue. They were the company that were creating the console, so the dev team knew some tricks to get it to look better than it normally would. The second issue, though, it wasn't quite as simple to fix. Sure, the Nintendo 64 was a powerful console, but it also had a very limited amount of usable memory. In other words, having 4 separate cameras showcasing separate views of a completely 3D world was going to come at a cost, which was a slower game at a lower frame rate, and that's just not going to work with a racing game. So how are they going to make this work? Well, it was clear that they were going to have to compromise on something, and that wasn't going to be the 4-player multiplayer or the fully 3D courses. Instead, the team thought of another solution, making the racers pre-rendered images instead of 3D models. This would save a ton on resources, allowing the game to run at a higher frame rate. Not to mention, by using 2D images for the racers, it opened up new possibilities, like 4-player battle mode, something that the programmers on the team originally thought would be impossible to implement. They knew they had to try though. After all, leaving it out would have been a major blow to this game. People love Super Mario Kart's battle mode. So of course, when Mario Kart 64 eventually got announced, that was something the interviewers were asking Miyamoto about time and time again. That put him in a tough spot. No one on the team knew if it was technically possible to do this yet, so he wasn't able to confirm that it was going to be added to the game. That caused people to begin circulating rumors that there wouldn't be a battle mode in Mario Kart 64 because Miyamoto wasn't going to bother. But that couldn't be further from the truth. They were trying, even though they didn't think it was gonna happen. Thank goodness they came up with that idea for the pre-rendered racers, because it was possible only because of that. Now, unfortunately, that wouldn't solve the overarching issue that I brought up earlier. Even if the racers are going to be 2D images, they still needed to make the 3D models to render for those images. And as we know, the team was not very experienced in 3D. The person in charge of getting all these Mario characters ready for their 3D racing debut was none other than Tomoaki Kuroome. Luckily, he had worked on a 3D racing game before, Stunt Race FX, to kind of warm up to this 3D stuff. But as the character designer for Mario Kart 64, things were a lot more complicated and much more intense. He ended up having quite a hard time working with Mario and his pals. You'd think it wouldn't be that bad. I mean, we weren't starting from nothing here. The team was free to use the already usable Mario model that was designed for Super Mario 64's pre-rendered promotional art, but it wasn't really that useful. This Mario was not made to sit in a cart behind a steering wheel, so Kuroome had to painstakingly edit every part of the model to make sure he looked good sitting in a vehicle. All this was done by trial and error, one part at a time, which made Mario the most difficult model that he had to work on. A close second in difficulty was Yoshi, thanks to his tail. But he managed to work through it and create the lovely visuals that we see today. So that's how the 2D, 3D visuals came to be. But how did the team make the gameplay itself? Of course, it borrows a lot from Super Mario Kart, but that wasn't the original plan for Mario Kart 64. No, they were intending, at least at first, to take a massive departure from the status quo. While the development team were checking out the Nintendo 64, they paid particular attention to the 3D analog stick, which gave them their first big idea for Mario Kart 64. To completely change the way that you control the karts in every single way possible. To give more detail, instead of a simple kart racer, they wanted to make Mario Kart 64 a full-blown simulation racing game. To start bringing this idea to life, the team bought some RC cars and got to work analyzing and researching the mechanical and physical properties of these small little vehicles. They ended up making a prototype off of all this data, and what they made was incredibly realistic. In fact, it was such a realistic game that it was completely unplayable. It didn't feel like you were driving a go-kart anymore, and the playtesters did not like that at all. The team realized that this kind of game would be way too niche, so that initial prototype they made ended up being completely scrapped, with the only thing saved being the grip and friction calculations. They decided that going forward, they needed to make these controls straightforward and easy to understand, but they knew that making things too easy would be boring. They wanted to make sure to add some depth to the gameplay, and that's why they added mini turbos. Well, technically, the mini turbos were in Super Mario Kart, but it was a hidden feature that was only documented in official player guides. Because of that, many people had no idea that it was in the game, myself included. So for Mario Kart 64, they decided to actually tell the players that the feature was there. That way, more advanced players would have something to keep them coming back to improve their times. Not only did they add a description on how to pull off the trick in the game's manual, they also made the smoke behind the carts change color depending on how much charge the player built up. And that small change would end up becoming a staple of the Mario Kart series for decades to come. Keeping things interesting was one of the main focuses for the development team. They were very determined to make sure this game did not get boring. For instance, the enemy AI was vastly improved over Super Mario Kart. Your fellow racers could now drift and cut you off, and it was little things like that that kept things fresh every single race. It wasn't just them adding a bunch of stuff to keep things interesting. No, they actually removed some stuff too because it was too boring, like no item mode. As the name suggests, this scrapped mode was just racing without any items, and they were planning to add it to the game so they could appeal to serious racers like F-Zero fans. They figured some people would love that, but when they gave that build to the playtesters, almost every one of them skipped the no item mode thinking it was just gonna be too boring. So they removed it. But not all was lost for serious players. The team did make sure to add in time attack, so that way there would at least be a mode specifically designed for people to focus on getting the best possible times. And speaking of those courses, to keep them interesting and not just a flat plane, the team wanted to make sure to take full advantage of that 3D space they had by adding verticality to the game's courses. That way players could go up and down and all the way around. Tadashi Sugiyama was the one who did most of the course designs. He was the visual director of Mario Kart 64 and ended up later being the producer of Wii Fit. I even made a video detailing the development of Wii Fit just recently. You should check out that video right after this one. In the official Japanese guidebook from Mario Kart 64, Sugiyama recounted that one of his biggest takeaways while developing the game was to limit how much turning was required of the player to prevent motion sickness. That's actually why a few courses had to be scrapped, even though they were some really good ideas. For instance, there was originally a giant multi-story parking garage that you would be able to drive up. The team really liked how it looked. It was a lot more realistic than what was usually included in a game like this. It was a nice change of pace with a good gimmick. But unfortunately, players got sick from the amount of turning that you were required to do, so it had to be scrapped. There was also another course that ended up getting scrapped, but it wasn't because there were too many turns, it was because it was too long. It was a giant city you could drive around complete with a castle in the middle. You would have raced around a bunch of different buildings and a cute pond on your way to the goal. But as I said, it was way too long to race through, so it was cut from the final game. What a shame. Alright, mark this down. This is one for the history books because this is the first time on Beta64 that we have gotten to talk about the Giga Leak. Specifically, the Nintendo leak from July 2020. This major event opened the world up to a vast amount of information from this early era of Nintendo's gaming history. Mario Kart 64 happens to have an entire folder dedicated to itself in the leak, and we can find quite a few things in there from very early stages of the game's development. For example, that giant scrap city that I mentioned before, yeah, it's in here. Except it wasn't called city, it was called town. Here it is. And yeah, the developers were right. It is a long one. I mean, this town has everything. A cafe to relax at, a farm for farming in, tunnels to drive through, restaurants to eat at, and so much more. Now, even though this town has a lot of roads, which you can see on this minimap, you weren't going to drive through every single one of them, but still, it was just far too long to make a complete loop. So what ended up replacing it? Well, it turns out the enemy placement file for town contains data that ended up being used in Luigi Raceway. So it's theorized that this town course was replaced specifically by Luigi Raceway. We didn't see a level quite like this for a long time, but nowadays city levels have made quite a few appearances in Mario Kart games, like Mario Kart Tour, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe DLC, and Mario Kart World even has its own city, Crown City, that you can drive around to your heart's content. But hold on, Andrew, what about the parking garage you also mentioned? Anything related to that in the Nintendo leak? Well, actually, yeah, but unfortunately not an entire model. The only thing we got is just a few textures that were associated with it. Of these though, the most interesting have to be the floor signs. Because of these, we're able to see that there was originally 4 floors and a roof that you could drive up to reach the top. But of course, this never came to be in the final game. And by the time Mario Kart 64 was first revealed to the public at Shoshinkai 1995, these two courses had already been scrapped. Oh, but I should say that back then, it wasn't called Mario Kart 64, it was actually revealed under a different title, Super Mario Kart R. Okay, I am getting a bit ahead of myself though. Let me explain first what a Shoshinkai even is. It was a private event set up by Nintendo for distributors, developers, publishers, and the press to attend, so that way the company could show off all of its cool new stuff. Shoshinkai 1995 happened on November 24th, and immediately following that, on the 25th and 26th, Nintendo held a public event that anyone could attend, called Famicom Space World, or just Space World for short. At Shoshinkai 1995, Nintendo showed off the final design for the Nintendo 64, along with a bunch of games that were planned for launch, like their new Mario Kart game complete with 4-player multiplayer, which was reported by news outlets to still be planned as a launch title for the new system. So, let's dive into the event and take a closer look at this early build of Super Mario Kart R. Now, unfortunately, Super Mario Kart R was only shown off as a video at Shoshinkai. There was no demo that attendees could actually play. In fact, the only playable games at Space World 1995 was Super Mario 64 and the eventually cancelled Kirby Bowl 64. So that means the only thing we have is just a bit of footage to look at, not an expansive demo. But that's okay, because honestly, a lot of what they showed here looks relatively close to the final game. I mean, there are some minor differences, like how in Banshee Boardwalk, the welcome sign used to be much further away from the castle, and it was also a whole lot darker around here. So to brighten things up in the final game, they added some lanterns over here. You'll also notice that the box that holds items in the UI is permanently on screen in this early build of the game, with a question mark inside of it. To save screen real estate, the retail build that we all know and love just has the box appear when you get an item and disappear once you've used it. Now, Computer and Video Game Magazine issue 171 has a screenshot of this build of the game that allows us to see the early UI even better. We've got some different colored text that's placed on different areas of the screen, and that Go text ended up being completely removed from the final version. This next change is kinda UI related. See, in Shoshinkai 1995's footage, we get to see 2-player multiplayer in 2 different ways. Horizontal split screen, which is normal, and vertical split screen, which ended up getting scrapped. But it must have happened relatively late in development because it's still an unused feature in the final game. If you use a GameShark code to get access to the game's debug menu, you can set the screen mode to be 2 players LR, which is left-right. Now we're able to see what things would have looked like if this feature had made it to release. Now, what about the racers themselves? Are there any changes here? Yes, there are. Big and small. For the small change, Bowser's driving a blue kart that was eventually changed to be orange. And for the big change, look right behind him. Yeah, that's an entirely scrapped character, Magic Koopa, also known as Kamek. Whether it's specifically the guy from Yoshi's Island is up for debate, but he's definitely not in the final version of Mario Kart 64. I will admit though, it's kinda hard to see him in this footage, so for an even better look at this guy, we'll have to head a few months into the future to E3 1996. Now at this point, E3 was a fresh new concept. This was only the second one to happen ever. It was a testament to the changing landscape of the gaming industry. They went from piggybacking on the Consumer Electronics Show to getting their own event to showcase gaming products. But for Super Mario Kart R, there really wasn't any major changes compared to Shoshinkai. It was still called Super Mario Kart R, it still featured Kamek, but this time we got to see a lot more gameplay, which means yes, we do have a lot more to see here. Like an early title screen! This screen not only features an early logo for the game and a completely different background render, but it also has a placeholder music track that was pulled from the Nintendo 64 SDK. And look who's in the background. That's right, it's our friend Magic Koopa. What a great way to start off E3. Lots of good stuff here, but unfortunately, we didn't have all good news. By this point, the game had been delayed from its attempt to be a launch title. I mean, it is to be expected though. The release of the Nintendo 64 was about a month away, and the team still hadn't settled on what to call the game yet. And you know what, speaking of the name, what on earth does the R actually stand for? Well, at E3, it was revealed that the R stood for rendered. Or at least that's what Maximum Magazine reported in their E3 1996 issue. It's entirely possible that they just made this up or heard it from a wrong source, since other magazines were still saying they had no idea what the R meant. Either way, let's start looking at this E3 footage. Still no demo, but we do have a lot of trailers that were showed off at the show. Some of the clips were even projected onto the booth for attendees to look at while they waited in line to play other games, like Pilotwings 64. Part of that projected footage was even given out to news stations and media outlets on a beta cassette, which is great because it is way higher quality compared to a video recording of a video projected on a wall. Let's start by looking at how the UI changed. You'll remember before that the item box thing on the screen was permanently on there with a question mark in it. Well, they removed the question mark in this new build, though the blank item box is still here. Speaking of items, this footage shows us for the first time an actual look at the 3D item box, which looks to have originally been solid black boxes with different colored question marks on each side. This looks very different when compared to what we got in the retail build. Oh, and the graphics for these boxes are still in the final game too, just unused. Around this point in the E3 footage, we can also see another very interesting change. The racers originally talked. Check out right over here. When Mario accidentally hits this little portion of the wall, you'll see a text bubble appear that says, "Oops." This was completely removed later in development. That's all we ever got to see of it, but it turns out that isn't everything that he could have said. Because of the July 2020 Nintendo leak, we actually have access to the source code for this speech bubble feature, which reveals that racers could say one of 4 things: oops, ouch, oh, and hime, which is Japanese for a shriek. And despite there being plenty more footage to look at, that's really all we need to see. Well, except for 2 other changes. But unlike the ones we already looked at, these 2 were not done by choice. The first change is this advertisement that appears on this side of the track. At first glance, it just looks like the Goodyear logo, and let me tell you, I know they don't have the rights to do that. But it's okay, because it's not actually the Goodyear logo. No, it's the Goodyear logo. Though it's kind of hard to see though. Here, the Giggly gives us a better look at this advertisement. And yeah, it was probably scrapped just because it looks way too similar to the real logo it's spoofing. They replaced this with Koopa Air in the final game, but even then it was still too similar, so outside of Japan, they changed it even further. Now, the second change that wasn't done by choice happens to be with the game's character portraits. Notice how they stare directly at the camera with completely lifeless eyes. Later on, they changed these to look more lively, and that's only because of a tragic data loss incident. So this is a good time for me to remind you to back up your hard drives, especially older ones. Before the switch to solid state, those spinning hard disks could go out in a snap. One bad bump, or even just some bad luck, was all it took to lose months of work. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened to the Mario Kart 64 development team. So those lifeless portraits during a race, those weren't the only ones that were lifeless. They're actually based off the player select portraits, which we can see here thanks to Nintendo Power's E3 1996 issue. Or if you want to see an even higher quality version, here's the one that they uploaded online. Even though they do kind of just sit there doing nothing, the team was okay with this. It wasn't like it was the end of the world, but they knew that this wasn't the best that they could do. They had an idea of making them blink and look more alive, but because these are static models, there wasn't anything they could do without remaking them all over again. And that is exactly what they ended up having to do. The hard drive where they were keeping all of the models for the player select screen crashed hard. They had backups of it, but it didn't cover everything that they needed to repair this screen. So in the end, they had to do it all again from scratch. But since they were already considering doing that, Director Kono took it as a sign that it was meant to be. And when it was all said and done, the team vastly preferred the new models that they had made because it just had so much more life in it. But I do want to go back to that early selection screen because, wow, that is a great look at Magic Koopa. We can also see now that he was eventually replaced by Donkey Kong, and it wasn't until Mario Kart Tour that Kamek was finally added to the series in late 2021. Of course, that was just a mobile game, but in Wave 5 of the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pack in 2023, he finally got his big moment as a playable character on the main game's roster. After E3 was all said and done, the next time we got a look at Super Mario Kart R was at Shoshinkai 1996, but this time it was under the final name Mario Kart 64. Though for some reason, news outlets that were reporting on that footage called the game Super Mario Kart 64. I don't know where they got that name from, but even Nintendo of America's official coverage of the show called it Super Mario Kart 64. But according to the Shoshinkai footage, at this point, it was planned to just be called Mario Kart 64. Taking a look at all of this footage, it's clear that things have gone from being close to the final game to being the same as the final game. The item boxes look correct, Bowser is in his orange cart, and Kamek is now officially Donkey Kong. But just because we don't have much to see in this footage doesn't mean that we're done comparing early versions of the game. From this point to the release of the game, there were lots of news outlets sharing footage and screenshots of Mario Kart 64 with gamers all around the world. And some of these news outlets ended up using media from early builds of the game. For instance, there was a special that was broadcast on TV Tokyo in Japan on November 28, 1996. It was called 64 Mario Stadium, and it showed off the Nintendo 64 along with new footage of Mario Kart 64. This would be less than a month from the launch of the game, and there shouldn't really be anything to see, right? But there is. We can see, extremely briefly, a scrapped item that was planned for the game, the feather. It only shows for like a few frames at most during the item roulette, but it's definitely there, plain as day, the feather. They had a section of this TV special where some lucky kids could play the game too, but unfortunately the feather is nowhere to be found there, meaning that this part of the footage is actually from an earlier build than what was played when they filmed this. But lucky for you, we can see the feather in action in the final game with a Game Shark code. Look at him go! And that's not the only scrapped item. The Nintendo League also shows us some more planned items for the game that didn't make it in, like marbles, a 10-ton weight known as Singer, and a Yoshi egg, which skipped Mario Kart 64 but eventually made it into Double Dash. We can also learn a bit more about the weight item from some source code found in the leak. But it's not much code, it's actually extremely simple without any real functionality. Let me describe it to you. It would have spawned 11 stars and a big bubble all in a row, kinda like a placeholder ball and chain. Maybe you could have attached the weight to another player to slow them down? At least that's the thought. It doesn't appear in any screenshots or footage, so we can't see it in action unfortunately. But that doesn't mean we don't have more screenshots to see with other things. Turns out Nintendo themselves posted screenshots on their websites around that time that shows off various early builds of Mario Kart 64. For instance, Moo Moo Meadows originally took place during sunset instead of midday, and is also missing this gate here. In that same screenshot, the portraits and numbers on them are facing the opposite direction for some reason. Now in Calamari Desert, we can see a version that doesn't have the train crossing signs present. Next up, we've got to head over to Luigi Raceway to see a couple more changes. First, that checkerboard pattern on the wall is a different color, and the 64 sign ended up moving further down the track, closer to the finish line in the final game. But I have saved the most interesting screenshot that Nintendo posted for last. Here it is. This right here is a mini bomb cart. It's kind of hard to tell, just looking at this, because it's normally yellow. Here in the screenshot, it's dressed up like a cute little snowman. Turns out the development team was originally planning to have themed bomb carts specifically tailored to every course in the game. Check it out, this is another one of those themed mini bomb carts from Nintendo Magazine System, December 1996 issue. Here it shows off a multicolored striped bomb cart that is absolutely adorable. And you know what, since I got my magazines out, let's take a look at Computer and Video Games Magazine issue 181. It's got a fantastic look at an early fake item box. And it's funny, by the time that this issue went out to subscribers, Nintendo had already released Mario Kart 64 in Japan. But even though the game has now released, there are still some changes that we haven't seen quite yet. You know, we can say the same thing about the Giga Leak, even though we are so far past the release of Mario Kart 64 and we've looked at pretty much everything in the game, we still have so much more that we can look at. We've already seen some of this leak, but I think now's the perfect time to take a deeper dive into it and see what we can find. First, I think it'd be a good idea to check out some early mini-maps. Now, while most of them look relatively similar to the final game, just with thicker lines or maybe a few missing turns in Bowser's Castle, the same can't be said for Royal Raceway. It looks like it went through a major redesign at some point in development that added in the iconic jump to the course. And keeping in line with all that UI talk, this appears to be an early speedometer that has got a very placeholder vibe to it. Doubt it would have made it into the final game looking like this. But there isn't just UI to look at. There are quite a few unused textures from the leak, and the ones that I want to focus on were planned to be used for a couple scrapped course hazards, Tornado and Typhoon. A tornado was planned to appear in Calamari Desert, made up of a bunch of smoke particles. Unfortunately, we can't see this in action, and all we have left texture-wise is this soil graphic that was meant to be kicked up by the tornado. But don't worry, even though we can't see what it looked like exactly, we can see what would have happened if you got hit by it, thanks to an unused flag in the final game called Hit Storm. As you'd expect, it sends you flying. Now, what about the Typhoon? Well, it was supposed to look relatively the same, but instead of kicking up dirt, it would have thrown around these leaves. It's unknown exactly where this storm would have taken place, but it's assumed it would have likely been Koopa Troopa Beach. Speaking of which, that course also planned on having a special hazard that ended up getting scrapped too. Sharks. Yeah, that's right, at some point along Koopa Troopa Beach, up to 4 sharks would have spawned to try to attack the player. The leak gives us a small look at this, thanks to a nice shark fin texture that was found in it. But these are just 2D images. This is Mario Kart 64, dang it! A 3D racing game. Let's see some 3D cars. The first we'll look at are these 2 scrapped RVs that were planned for Toad's Turnpike. The wider one is called RV, and the taller one is called RV Old. They look very similar to one of the vehicles driving around in the final game, which is called the Sedan. It's totally possible that these 2 RVs were specifically replaced by this vehicle, but why that is, I don't really know. And that's not the only vehicle in this leak. There's apparently a model of an F1 car in there too. I say apparently because I couldn't find it myself, and the tweet that talked about it was deleted. But apparently, it was found in the Giga Leak as both a Super FX model and a Nintendo 64 model as well. All of this was contained in the Mario Kart 64 folder, so it's likely that this model was meant for early testing, seeing as it's all based on the SNES file format. But of course, what's a race without a prize? Let's check out some early trophies that are in the leak too. First, in Cup_Old, you can see an early large and small trophy, with the only difference really being the base, which is black. And instead of using silver and gold in the smaller trophy, it's all just gold in the leak. We can go back even further in development though. Check out this trophy variant, probably one of the earliest ones. It's very simple, and some say it resembles the trophies of Super Mario Kart more than the ones from Mario Kart 64. And speaking of Super Mario Kart's trophies, if you played the game, you know they come in 3 different varieties. Small for 50cc, large for 100cc, and you get one with Mario's head for 150cc. You ever think it's odd that we only got 2 different kinds of trophies in Mario Kart 64? The smaller one was used for both 50 and 100cc, and the larger one was given to 150cc. But I have a theory that that was not the original plan. I think that the smaller one was only meant for 50cc, the larger one for 100cc, and then for 150cc, I believe it would have used this scrapped Mario Head trophy that was also found in the Giga Leak. It's very shiny, with chiseled marble on the bottom, truly worthy of a 150cc win. Now I could end the video there, but I have one more interesting model to look at. But this one, despite it being in the files for Mario Kart 64 and the Giga Leak, it's actually from an early version of Mario 64. Super Mario 64 also has quite an interesting development story with many changes. And the one piece that stands out in my mind is Stage 1, a completely scrapped level that was briefly shown at Shoshinkai 1995 in this promotional video. Well, that stage, in its entirety, is found in the Mario Kart 64 folder in the 2020 leak. Now, the textures aren't there, and I should say that it's also called Sample. So it's more than likely that this stage was not planned to be a course in Mario Kart 64. Instead, it was more likely to be an early test stage. Extremely early. And hey, maybe the developers used that F1 car here too to drive around in. Who knows? But what I do know is that eventually, I gotta cover Super Mario 64 again. So that's the development of Mario Kart 64. It's clear the dev team was trying to strike a nice balance between simple, easy to pick up gameplay and something more complex to appeal to veteran players. And I'd say they did a pretty good job. In the end, Mario Kart 64 accomplished what it set out to be: a normal game. A fun, normal game that didn't deviate too far from its inspiration on the SNES. Even so, it was a lot harder to develop than it was expected to be. But thanks to the entire team working together, eventually including Miyamoto, they managed to create a classic that is still loved to this day. And that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Don't forget that there is a behind the scenes of this Beta64 episode up on Patreon right now. If you enjoy Beta64, consider joining the Patreon to get new exclusive videos every single week, and you can even get your name alongside these other lovely producers. I'll see you next month for a new episode. Bye.